I've been asked several times to comment on statins and the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype. Here goes. Stay tuned. Before I get started, I think I need to define what is a phenotype. Well, here's the definition from Merriam-Webster, and that is the observable characteristics of traits of an organism that are produced by the interaction of the genotype and the environment, the physical expression of one or more genes. Okay, well, what's that mean in English? It really means, well, maybe in mathematical terms, your phenotype is your genotype plus the environment. Well, what is the genotype? Well, that's your genetics. What is the environment? Well, we have to kind of take a broad definition of what the environment is. It's your diet, exercise, accidents that may occur in your life, exposures to carcinogens, sleep habits, stress. Basically, it's your genetic makeup and life happening to it. Another concept I want to go into is called reification. Big fancy word, really means nothing more than an abstract concept treated as a material thing. And the most notable example I can come up with that is a reification is when we talk about intelligence quotient, IQ. Everybody who goes around and say, oh, I have an IQ of this, I have an IQ of that, as if it's a thing. Well, for one thing, intelligence is so multifaceted, it's impossible to capture it in a single number. That's kind of a naive approach to it. What it really is just a measurement of how well you did on a standardized test. This quality of the IQ really shows the fallacy of reification in this context. Now, there's another sort of reification, at least I call it reification. Somebody who's really into definitions might argue against this. And that occurs when we take something that's on a continuum and we treat it as discrete categories. The perfect example of that would be type 2 diabetes, where if we just use HbA1c as the measure, well, that's on a continuum. Yet we say somebody who's at 6.4, for example, is diabetic, and somebody who's at 6.3 is only pre-diabetic, as if these categories are real things. No, it's just a continuum. Now, that is not a fallacy to do this. Sometimes it's a convenience. Sometimes you just have to set a cut point. When you're doing, for example, a randomized control trial, you really want to take a very specific position. You want to have hard cutoff points so you're not messing around the borders too much. So that brings us to the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype and what's called the triad, the three characteristics of somebody who has this phenotype. Remember, what do we mean by a phenotype? Well, it is not just the genetics, but it's the environment. And in this case, we're mainly talking about the diet. So 4 clinical studies in response to a low-carb, high-fat diet, this is the triad, the 3 characteristics of this phenotype. And that is triglycerides under 70 milligrams per deciliter, high-density lipoprotein above 80 milligrams per deciliter, and you can see the millimoles per liter equivalents here, and LDL over 200 milligrams per deciliter. These first 2, conventional medicine would tell us, are good things. This third one, well, it would give the conventional doctor a heart attack thinking about it. So in this triad, 2 things improve, 1 thing gets worse, and I put worse in quotes, and we'll get to why. This is what I call the baseline lean mass hyperresponder. It is a criteria that is used for these randomized control trials that study this phenotype. A few other characteristics: a low BMI, probably a decreased LP(a), and I say that just based on the fact that if you go on to a high-fat, certainly with a high saturated fat diet, your LP(a) is probably going to decrease somewhat. Most likely they're going to end up with this pattern A LDL fractionation. It's an advanced test you can get on your lipids, and generally it correlates with trigs to HDL ratio. So if you have a very low trigs to HDL ratio, you're likely to be pattern A. So let's look at a case study. We're going to look at a particular individual and their response to the low-carb, high-fat diet. Over time, their trigs reduced from 231 to 73 milligrams per deciliter. Their HDL nearly doubled from 31 to 61, and their LDL went up substantially from 136 to 218 milligrams per deciliter. This doesn't quite meet all the criteria. The triglycerides are close. They're not quite under 70. The HDL, not quite as close, given where it started at 31, going up to 61 is pretty good, and the LDL meets the criteria. I would call this person, and by the way, it's me, 80% LMHR just by taking the ratios here. And really the real reason not an LMHR is not the trigs, but as much, but the HDL is a bit off the cutoff points for the randomized control trials. Other characteristics, well, a BMI around 24, that's actually a little too high, and that's part of the environment. I still may be potentially full LMHR, but I haven't subjected my genotype, my genetics, quite to the environment that it needs to be. I need to lose about 20 more pounds, which is my goal right now. I need to get down from like 180 closer to 160. I'm 6 feet tall in order to be a lean mass person to begin with. My LP(a) did go down. Now I don't have an early measure of it, but as time went on, it did go down from 14 nanomoles per liter to under 10 nanomoles per liter, just no longer can be measured. And I'm assuming I was pattern B, given that my trigs to HDL ratio was 7.45 back 15 years ago when I knew nothing about this because definition of this phenotype really didn't exist. So I'm assuming back then I must have been a pattern B LDL fractionation. I think it's a safe assumption. Now it has actually been tested and I am a pattern A LDL fractionation. So what's the point of this? First of all, this is the $64,000 question. Is the high LDL for the lean mass hyperresponder who's on a low carb, high fat diet, which kind of the two have to go together, is it a cardiovascular event risk factor? And that's really what we want to know, because we look at this. The underlying things here are part of the triad. HDL increases, conventional medicine tells us that's good. Trigs decrease, same thing. BMI decreases, well, conventional medicine tells us to a point, that's good. It's not part of the triad, but it is a characteristic, I think, of most people who are LMHRs. The LP(a) probably decreases with this diet, and the fractionation migrates to pattern A if it didn't start at pattern A. So all these things are good things, but the LDL increases, and conventional medicine tells us that that's a bad thing. So the question really comes down to, do the improvements either override this, or does the nature of the LDL in this circumstance mitigate the risk? And that's what needs further study. At the time of this recording, the indications are that it is pointing that way, but we really should be cautious and we really should wait until more studies are done. I would suggest you go to the YouTube channels of Nick Norwitz or Dave Feldman, the LMHR videos. Just look it up under YouTube because they will give you better explanations than I can, which is why I'm not attempting to actually explain the science behind it. I'm just making these observations and how does it impact us as people possibly being asked by our doctors to take statins or trying to use this to determine what our decision should be when it comes to statins. What does it mean for us? If it can be shown that high LDL for this phenotype is not harmful, and if you are or are close to being a classic lean mass hyperresponder, this may inform your decision on whether you even have a cholesterol problem. The risk calculations could take the LMHR status into account. My dream is that instead of having a group of 100 people, say, who each have 10% risk, those same 100 people could be divided more precisely into maybe 50 with a 20% risk and 50 with little or no risk. Maybe that's a pipe dream. If this situation turns out to be common and not dangerous, then our doctors are not giving the right treatment to these people by not making this distinction. Is it the case that this distinction makes a difference? It seems so, but let's all wait. Let's not fall victim to wishful thinking. Let's wait until all the data comes out, all the information comes out, and we know that the traditional and conventional medical community is going to probably not want to accept it at first, but eventually it's either going to gain ground with the medical community or it's not, depending on the results of the randomized control trials. So let's take a look again at my situation, because this is an analysis you could probably do for yourself. I'm fortunate in that I have a relatively complete lipid panel record from long before I started on the low carb, high fat diet. I actually had total cholesterol around 213, LDL was not extraordinarily high, HDL was horrible, remnant cholesterol was horrible. That is VLDL, very low density lipoproteins. Triglycerides were just absolutely horrible. They are generally proportional to the remnant cholesterol. The trigs to HDL ratio was through the roof, 7.45. The charts that show the risk factors there, they don't even go up to 7.45. They usually stop at 4 and say, okay, anybody 4 and above has this risk. My HbA1c was 5.9%, which puts me solidly in the pre-diabetic level. And my Lp(a) was not measured then, but given that more recent measurement showed me at 14 nanomoles per liter at one point, then I have to imagine my Lp(a) was at that or possibly more. So my self-analysis of this profile is that I was a very unhealthy lipid profile. And this requires a response. Whether that response was statins or not, we can argue, and as a matter of fact, I argue that the statins actually didn't improve the quality. This was a case where the LDL lipid results indicated a very unhealthy condition. So let's look at one of my most recent test results. Now these numbers are slightly different than what I showed earlier, because earlier I was showing best case, worst case, the extremes of what I had. This is from an actual recent lipid panel. My total cholesterol is up substantially. The LDL is up substantially, not quite over that 200 on this particular reading. The HDL was nearly as high as it's ever been. It had been at 61 at one point, but now it's at 59. The remnant cholesterol, relatively low. Triglycerides low. The ratio, 1.44. These things, by the way, do vary considerably. I look at the average. On another test I had, the one that was presented to my current doctor, it was actually over 2, and he was a little concerned. Well, that ratio is over 2. You've been telling me it's been under 2. Well, it goes up and down. The LDL fractionation, I've had that test twice. Both times came back as pattern A. HbA1c was down at 5.4%. Not as good as I want it to be, and in fact I got off low carb for a little while and it went back up, so I'm definitely back on the low carb now. It wasn't intentional, it was just one of those situations, holidays, travel, all that sort of thing. I wasn't eating low carb and I saw what the bad effect of that was. And my Lp(a) is unmeasurable by the Quest diagnostic labs. So my analysis of this is a much healthier profile, but it's not perfect. The LDL may not be a problem, depending on the research results that we're all looking forward to seeing. So my closing thoughts on this are that no statements, no ideas in medicine and personal health should be considered absolute. The statement that high cholesterol is always bad, and then back that up with population statistics that show in large groups of people the risk is higher for people with higher cholesterol, that ignores the individuals. That ignores all the people who don't have a heart attack, even though, say, the incidence of events goes from 10% to 20% of the population. Well, what about the other 80% who didn't have an event? Well, yeah, for that population, the higher cholesterol, the higher the incidence of cardiovascular events, but it's not a perfect correlation. And when we make absolute statements, we cut off all further understanding of what's really going on. Same thing with statins. I don't take an absolute position that statins are always the wrong treatment. For example, I've used this before, somebody with familial hypercholesterolemia who is not statin intolerant, statins may be a necessary treatment for them. Similarly, there are some doctors who think that low dose, maybe 2.5 milligrams of Crestor every other day, would be helpful in stabilizing soft plaque. We also hear doctors saying, well, it's the pleiotropic effects. It's the anti-inflammatory effect of the statins that is actually given the statistical benefit that we do see in a lot of studies. To which I would simply ask, well, why aren't we developing medications that address the inflammation directly rather than a fortunate side effect? And to me, the unfortunate side effect of these statins are all the adverse effects and maybe even the lowering of cholesterol. So when it comes to the lean mass hyperresponder phenotype, we have to look at that carefully. And it may be the case that for 90% of the time, the increased LDL in that phenotype is not a problem. Maybe for 10% of the time it is. Remember, absolutes, they really don't help us. They don't help us understand, and they don't help us make decisions. We always have to be trading off. We always have to understand, no matter what, there are pluses and minuses associated with whatever we decide to do with our medical treatment. So that's all I've got on this. If you appreciate this content, please like, share, subscribe, and comment on this topic or others you'd like me to cover. And if you haven't seen this video, I recommend you take a look at it now. Thanks for listening.